welcome to today's Cyber Threat Report. Today's Thursday, June 30th, 2011. Joining us today, we have our relatively regular crew, Jim Clausing, John Hogoboom, Dave Gross, and I'm Brian Rexroad. If you would like to present some feedback or ask questions about this program, you can reach us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. cyberthreat@list.att.com. Email us your questions or feedback. Today on the program, we have some feedback on the recent Microsoft advisory on a reinstall activity associated with a threat. Jim Clausing will talk to us about that. John's going to initiate some discussion associated with a Juniper study related to security breaches, and there's some interesting statistics associated with that. Jim will also follow up with some discussion about some activity with RSA and associated with those recent attack activities, and I will provide sort of the cyber weather report and recent Internet anomalies that we are looking into to understand the security threats associated with that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and pass it to Jim Clausing. Let's talk about this Microsoft malware protection activity.
Thanks, Brian. A little over a week ago, Microsoft posted an entry on their on one of their blogs. They got picked up in the mainstream press and got a little twisted around, so that a lot of the stories that I saw elsewhere that were talking about this were saying that Microsoft was suggesting that if you got infected with this particular piece of malware, you basically needed to nuke the box and reinstall. What they were really saying is that this particular piece of malware, the popureb.e version, is a piece of malware that infects the master boot record, and we've talked about that a few times in the past. This is one way that malware attempts to protect itself so that it comes back after you reboot the machine. And this particular piece of malware, the new twist with the .e version is that it hooked itself into a driver to prevent folks attempting to disinfect the machine from being able to do so when the malware was running on the machine itself. They hooked the driver, and whenever you attempted to actually rewrite the master boot record from the running system, it would turn that read operation, or that write operation, into a read operation, which is where their title "Don't read it, don't write it, read it instead" comes from. It was actually kind of an interesting protection mechanism. What they were really saying, though, is in order to get rid of this, you need to boot from some alternative. You need to boot from alternative media, CD-ROM. They talk about in the article, I think, using the Windows recovery functionality of the CDs. And because, as I said, you can't rewrite the master boot record when this malware is actually running on the system. Some of the other folks that picked up on this were saying that when you did a fix MBR operation to rewrite the master boot record, that this somehow reinstalled the OS, and it doesn't. Often when you're using that recovery partition, you have the option to do so. But that's not what they were really saying here. But that does bring up another issue that we've talked about some amongst ourselves. I'm not sure that we've actually mentioned it on the Threatcast before or not. And that is how you go about disinfecting machines that have been infected. For a long time, my preferred method is nuke it and start over. Once you've been infected for any length of time, I usually feel like it's hard to get all of the pieces of the malware because you don't necessarily know what all has been installed. Once the first piece of malware gets on the machine, it will often connect out to some command and control and download secondary and tertiary payloads. And getting back to a clean state once it's been infected is oftentimes difficult to do. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jim. I was just kind of curious. One of the things I've always sort of wondered about that I'm not sure we know the answer to, but when a machine is cleaned, even if it is able to identify all of the malware that's on there, I've always sort of wondered to what extent it's actually being cleaned, or to what extent that the remediation is really just to kind of break the malware that's on there and leave it in place, so to speak.
Yeah, well, that's one of the issues. When you start over, even when you're cleaning a machine by doing a reinstall, the issues still remain. To be useful, you're going to have to restore some data that was on the machine before. Was this data infected? Is the malware hidden in this data that you're reinstalling? Two, how did the machine get infected in the first place? Have you patched whatever vulnerability they used, which may be the user itself? The user is oftentimes the most vulnerable piece in this. If we could get users to stop clicking on things, solve part of our problem, but even that wouldn't solve everything. So, yeah, that's one of the issues. Even when you're nuking from orbit, wiping the machine out and completely reinstalling, have you fixed the problem? And in a corporate environment where you've got fixed builds for the desktop PCs and the laptops, reinstalling actually usually isn't that big a deal. Home machines, how often have they been backed up? Corporate environment really clean? How locked down is the corporate environment, or are they allowing users to come in and plug in? So it's a bigger issue.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Jim, even when you reinstall, how long does it take as a home user to reinstall not only the operating system but all the applications? Getting all your original media to put in there, and dealing with all the license keys for all that and stuff like that. That's you have to do a lot of documentation up ahead of time in order to be able to even perform that function.
Yeah, and with if you're reinstalling all of your applications from the DVDs, that came in the box, if you can find them all, you get them all installed, and then you need to go and patch them again because they've been updated, a couple of times since you last installed. Even the antivirus software that I run on my home machines, DVD is from last November or something.
So
8 months worth of updates that still need to be downloaded from the internet.
Takes quite some time.
So these, one of my comments about this is these MBR boot sector these master boot record viruses. There's more than just this one. I think we've talked about TDSS before. They're a real pain. And the thing that's different about these is that they actually inject themselves on the system before Windows actually starts. So they can get into the picture before any of your operating system is up, any of your antivirus is up, unlike a lot of these other ones that maybe can be cleaned up. I've personally had particular challenges cleaning up TDSS, as you guys know. Off of various machines. So, and I guess the moral of the story here is back up often, right? Make sure you have backups of your system so that you can restore once the time comes.
Yeah, and that's if you're even aware that it's the master boot record has been infected when you're approaching a machine.
Right.
Right. Is there a way to tell when it's safe to just clean based on your antivirus versus do a complete reinstall, or do you always have to do a reinstall whenever you find an infection?
Yeah, well, the question is, are you sure that you got everything? And like I said, the interesting thing in this particular one that Microsoft was bringing up last week was not only do they infect the master boot record, but then they hook a driver at a low enough level that you can't clean the master boot record from the running system. And that's, in some of the other ones you've been able to, if you could kill the running processes, that the malware was running or injected into, you could then clean the master boot record from the running system. But with this one, even though it looks like the right operation succeeded, they actually, underneath the covers there, switched it to a read, and so you really didn't accomplish anything.
I have one last question about this, and then we can move on. What about the virtual machine environment? How does it affect that kind of space? Is a virtual machine vulnerable to this, to master boot record modification? It
is, but it's a virtual disk's boot record.
Okay, so there's still some protection there if you're running in a virtual machine, is that?
Well, the host isn't being infected if you're running in the virtual machine that's infected. They're infecting the master boot record on the virtual disk. So when you reboot the VM, it's still going to get nuked, get infected. In a virtual environment, you've got some other options for cleaning, because you can mount the virtual disk outside of the virtual machine to clean it that way, but it's still there.
It's a lot easier to revert to a previous snapshot and things like that with virtual machines, which is not as easy to go back in time on a physical machine. Okay.
So thanks very much, Jim, and others for that conversation there. I guess on the Juniper study, what kind of little tidbits can you bring to the table here, John?
Yeah, so there was a study that came out. Juniper actually commissioned a company called Ponemon Research. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they commissioned them to do a study on security breaches within companies. And they got a fair number of companies in the study, I think almost 600 or so. And there's some interesting results here. One of the big headlines of this is that 90% of those companies interviewed in the study did confirm that they've had some kind of security breach. The other 10% acknowledge that they don't know if they've been breached. So it's not that they haven't, it's just that they don't know if they have. There's some interesting, it's a pretty quick read, actually. We have the link up on the screen here. It's a fast read because there's lots of charts and graphs to kind of go through, but there are some interesting ones. I just brought one up in particular where some of the most serious cyber attacks experienced by various companies come from. Web-based attacks, SQL injection, hacking are the top three in that list there. We know that particularly with APT, SQL injection and hacking are definitely in there. Web-based attacks, maybe not so much. Those are more usually social engineering and phishing with APT. But I kind of found it interesting that malware was way down on the list here in terms of seriousness. Probably true, but...
I think that's an interesting observation, that the malware is way down on the list in the grand scheme of things. I think many organizations have considered that to be the biggest headache. But in fact, it's these weak web things, and I guess I'll go ahead and mention that seems to be sort of the theme behind some of the lulsec activity that is, sort of pointing out to some extent that these web-based attacks are just a little too easy and, facing right up on the internet, kind of asking to be hacked.
Yeah, one of the comments that I saw about this report, the reporter said they were surprised that the number was so high, and my reaction was anybody who doesn't think they've been hacked just hasn't noticed it. any environment that allows folks to travel with laptops, you're going to have some infections of some sort. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a large-scale infection or outbreak, but any organization that's got any sizable number of employees is going to have some situations where an employee clicks on a link they shouldn't, or browses to a website that's serving up a malicious ad. So folks that, at least the other 10% said they didn't know, they didn't say no, because if anybody said no, I'd say they're hiding their heads in the sand.
Absolutely.
Yep. And also, those web-based attacks and stuff, that's the front door, that's the immovable object, so to speak, that's always there, always on the public internet and, constantly available for attack. Whereas the other types of attacks, the attackers have to understand more about how the company is organized and find a way in and things like that.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, that's very good. Interesting observations here, and perhaps it was out of scope, but there was no mention of mobility here. In fact, we've talked about a couple of the mobility unique scenarios, loss of a device and the fact that that could have some consequences. Again, it may be out of scope in the context of network security, but certainly is one in terms of information security. So thanks, John. The next item was a follow-up for the RSA attacks. Jim, did you have an update for this?
Yeah, something that came across, that I came across today from one of the blogs that I follow from Kaspersky. One of my frustrations since the initial RSA attack hit the press back in March was that we really don't know what all the attackers got, and so there's been a lot of speculation. And what I saw today was an article that suggests that what we had suspected and what we've talked about a few times in the past is probably the case. While the attackers may have gotten the seed information for the tokens, it appears that all of the public attacks that we are aware of so far that supposedly used cloned secure ID tokens, it looks like they were all targeted with some sort of malware attack that was used to harvest
harvest the PIN information, is that?
Yeah, it was used to harvest the authentication host, the user ID, and the PIN. But we had guessed in the past that, or we had surmised in the past that, it was still going to require folks either brute forcing the PIN or something, and it looks like we're right that the bad guys are having to go out and find the user IDs and the authentication host and the PIN information, and apparently one guy quoted in the Kaspersky article, I don't remember where he was from now, said that it looks like in about 75% of the cases, including the big ones that Lockheed and that some sort of key logging malware was targeted at users in that environment, and that's how they grabbed the user ID and the authentication host information and the PINs. So, yeah, it's still one of my frustrations that we don't know what all really happened and what all the bad guys really got, but it's sounding more and more like our initial guesses were correct. And that's all I wanted to mention today.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Let's see here. So we can go ahead and take a look at some of the recent activities or anomalies that we're seeing on the Internet. I've kind of highlighted the ones that I believe here to be somewhat security related, or at least worthy of taking a little closer look at. One here that I'll point out, actually a couple of them that obviously are large anomalies, we believe to be innocuous. The first one here I believe to be associated with some gaming activity. There's a promotion for free use of a game that appears to be inspiring a lot of users. So we're seeing activity show up. That does show up as an anomaly, but it doesn't appear to be security related. So digging in a little bit more to some of these other cases, first of all, is we're seeing a reasonable amount of scanning activity on port 53. In particular, this case, it's port 53 TCP, which is often used for zone transfers. We expect that this is probably somebody that's digging around looking for available DNS resolvers that are accessible from the Internet. As you can see from the graph here, looking back 30 days, the activity is somewhat spurious. I was considering whether to relate this to another anomaly that we have. It's not clear if they're related or not, but the second one is actually related to UDP 53. So this is actually moving down to the bottom of the list here in terms of ones that we believe to be security related. Now this one at the bottom, and we'll go ahead and take a look at that. See if I can find it here first. Here it is.
And we've seen a lot of the TCP/23 before, right?
Yeah, we've seen it before, yes, absolutely. This is not a completely new or unusual activity, but we have absolutely seen it. And but there's been some increase in the frequency and the extent. Mm-hmm. And this case here, where we're seeing source port activity, or actually scanning activity on port 53, we've also seen a couple of alerts associated with source port activity on port 53 UDP. Both of these are relatively strong indicators of DNS amplification attacks or reflection attacks. We've talked a little bit about this in the past. As you can see here, we have some spikes that are showing up. If I showed back further, you would see some continued activity associated with this. But there seems to be sort of an increase associated with this activity. Again, I believe it very strongly to be associated with DNS amplification attacks. And, one of the necessary criteria to be able to conduct DNS amplification attacks effectively is to have access to DNS resolvers that will help with that amplification. So there is a possibility that these two are related. There isn't a strong time correlation associated with them, but in any case, you want to pay attention. Now, the second one, there is an Internet Protect alert that was posted associated with this activity, and so some advice associated with that in that alert. Go ahead, Jim.
TCP port 53, it should be noted that TCP is not particularly useful for the amplification type denial of service because it requires a completed three-way handshake, so it's much more difficult to spoof the source. So that's one of the reasons why UDP 53 is used for these type of amplification attacks so often. Is it's easy to spoof the source, so you can get the increased traffic sent back to your innocent victim. But with TCP, these are likely not related to that because it's much more difficult to spoof.
Yeah, absolutely not directly related to the attack, but possibly associated with identifying servers that would be able to facilitate the attack.
And regarding the 53 UDP, I know we've mentioned it before, but if you have open resolvers that are accessible on the Internet, I'd question why you have that and ask you to please clean that up or lock it down to only those people who need to be able to access it.
Right.
Because that's how reflection attacks occur. That's one of the number one candidates for being able to commit a distributed denial of service attack against somebody anonymously. It really allows you to be used unwittingly to participate in DDoS attacks against people.
Right. It'll load down servers and as well as cause havoc for others. So there are a couple of reasonable protection mechanisms. One is if you're authoritative for domains, only resolve domains for which you're authoritative.
Right.
And secondly would be to put some throttling in place to control how many resolutions from a particular source might exist. So both those will be good protections, not just for others, but also for your own domain resources as well. John. The next item we'll look at is probing activity associated with port 1080. We'll also take a quick look at probing activity associated with port 81 as well. First, 1080 is associated with SOX. This is fairly typical activity, but we've certainly seen an increase in the scanning activity here. We're looking at the number of probes per hour up in the nearing 10 million at the peak here. And that is probes per hour that we've been seeing. So a relatively significant increase in activity there. Most often, this is a case where there's an attempt to identify hosts that can be used for anonymity purposes, that is to hide the identity of perhaps malicious activity that we'd be performing. So something to keep in mind if you have any exposed SOC servers. The next one is a little bit different, and disregard this note about anonymity here. In this particular case, port 81 is one that we haven't really identified a specific application associated with it. The scanning activity that we're seeing is relatively spurious, but it does exist, and so you want to probably pay attention if you have something that's exposed on port 81.
Yeah, port 81, a lot of the times when I have seen it, it's been another web server showing up on, that is put up 81, maybe with a different name but share the same server if they choose not to use virtual names or something like that. But, yeah, we really don't know what they're looking for on this one.
I've also seen them host like administrative portals for that web server via those alternate ports. Like they'll have a control panel type interface if it's a shared web hosting server kind of thing.
All right, well, that's a good point. If there is an administrative interface to a web server, that would be something an attacker might like to get to. So thanks very much. Those are good comments. So looking at some of the recent Internet Protect alerts, we've had a few here. We've already talked about a couple of them here. We talked about the port 53 TCP, port 53 UDP. Both of those are ones that we understand. The next one we'll take a look at is port 139 TCP. This is one that is regularly being probed. But there was an increase in activity. This may be just somewhat experimental basis, mostly likely looking for vulnerable Windows systems. Does anybody here happen to know if Samba or a Linux-based file sharing system would respond to port 139? I think it might.
Yeah, it can, yes.
So that would be one thing to be concerned about as well, is we tend to generalize Windows systems, but this will be associated with any kind of Windows file sharing that might be exposed to the Internet. And they might be, trying to perform password guessing attacks against it or taking advantage of some kind of unpatched vulnerability. The next one here is actually a series of ports, 73, 2301, 2479, port 8000, and port 9090 TCP. We grouped these together because there was a very strong correlation in activity here. All five of those ports are graphed in this one graph, and they show a very strong time correlation. Quite honestly, I don't have a strong explanation for this, but if you have applications that are exposed on these ports, you want to pay attention to that. I don't know if anybody has any other theories about this, but I don't recall that we were able to identify a strong association between these.
No, other than if anybody's seeing this activity and can tell us, capture some of the traffic or something so that we can take a look at it to let us know, please do so.
And last but not least, we had previously reported on scanning sources. The number of sources are scanning on port 5900. This is virtual network computing. This activity is still continuing. We had seen an increase in the number of sources that are doing that scanning. Again, this is not particularly unusual activity. It's typically password guessing attacks against the application here, looking for opportunities to get into computers and be able to take over. So that's basically the activity we're seeing. And any final comments before we conclude? Okay, well, as we mentioned earlier, if you'd like to provide us feedback or if you have questions on the program or suggestions for topics we should cover, contact us at the email address cyberthreat@list.att.com. And for your information, we also have a podcast on iTunes now. Just search for AT&T Cyber Threat Report, and you'll be able to download us onto your iPod or iPhone and take us on the road. Thanks very much, and look forward to talking with you next time.